Franklin is a veteran police officer, a career police officer whose work included enforcing drug prohibition laws. And for many, many years, he worked for both the Maryland State Police, attaining the rank of major there, if I understand correctly. Also worked for the Baltimore City Police Department. And as I've jokingly said, appeared on the wire many times in that capacity. But he's now run away, so I don't know if he is going to really speak, but I'm pretty sure he is. LEAP, the organization he leads, is one of the most potent, effective, and valuable allies we have in the marijuana law reform movement and the whole drug law reform movement. There is no more valuable ally. And when LEAP was founded, we found a valuable friend. We found a group that has a credibility that no one else has. Now, I'm not sure why that is. Frankly, I'm a little jealous sometimes, because I don't care if you're a lawyer or you're a doctor, or you got a PhD in public policy or whatever the hell kind of letters you have after your name. A lot of people in our society will listen much more closely and take much more seriously the opinions given by someone who has been on the front lines, literally in the streets, fighting the so-called war on drugs, which is really a war on us and especially people of color. And when a police officer speaks, they listen. And when a whole national organization of present and past police officers speak, they have a credibility that the rest of us can only wish we had. Well, we're very lucky to have LEAP, and we're very lucky to have with us Mr. Neill Franklin. Please welcome him.
Well, again, thanks for having me. Dan, thanks for all the work and your team for putting this together. It's just been a great week. I enjoy coming here to the state of Missouri, and so here I am. I know that some of you have heard my story of transformation, and really, it really is just that, a transformation, but I know that some of you haven't, and I've always been reminded that I have to tell that story, because sometimes I've gotten before audiences and I haven't done it. You know, I've gotten before audiences who are about this issue, about moving this issue forward, and sometimes you get to a place where you just assume that people know things. And as we talk about, and there was during the panel where I was sitting, we talk about how do you move law enforcement to this place, to where they are no longer adversaries, but actually helping you make the change that not only makes community better, but makes their jobs better. See, a lot of law enforcement members don't realize that what we are here for today, this reform, they don't realize that their jobs would improve dramatically in a number of different ways, mainly safety, which should be of concern to them. So let me walk quickly down that road of my transformation, which is my story. And you know what? We all have stories about why we are here. You all have stories about why you're sitting in these seats, why this is of interest to you, and they're all different. And you should learn about the power in telling those stories. You just had your legislative representatives up here, and they gave you information on how to corner them. And you should be in a position of telling your story, why it is of interest to you. So mine, 33 plus years in Maryland law enforcement. I began with the Maryland State Police back in the late 1970s. And I entered into law enforcement literally on a whim. Even though my brother was already a state trooper, you know, I wasn't one of these kids that just wanted to be a police officer. And shortly after graduating from the Maryland State Police Academy, I was working then in the Washington, D.C. suburbs, and I was working out at the College Park State Police Barracks, and in the basement of the barracks, was this shady group of guys that would come and go all hours of the night. And they drove these wonderfully fancy cars, sports cars, and I was a brand new trooper, and I was like, who are these guys, right? What do? They seem like some very special folks. And I happened to end up talking to one of the sergeants one night, Fred Settle, and found out that they were the undercover narcs for the southern region of Maryland, the Washington, D.C. suburbs. And it was 6 of them. That's all, just 6. For like 7 counties. But that was back in the 1970s. We were just ramping up the drug war. You know, across the entire state, we probably had about maybe 30 troopers that did that work. Of course, now today we have an entire bureau, you know, of hundreds. So anyway, I thought it was rather neat, so I put in a transfer to be a member of that unit, and a year later, there I was. I was with them, driving the nice cars and wearing whatever I wanted to wear, coming and going as I pleased, and I had my assigned area, and I went and did the work. My first search warrant. You know, they got to break you in. You got to learn how to write a search warrant. It was a really big case, and I was going to be the affiant on a search warrant. So we rode around looking for a target. And we cruised the parking lot of an apartment complex where students from the University of Maryland, many of them lived. And lo and behold, on this balcony was this green thing about yay high. In the sunlight, it was a marijuana plant. And through my expertise and training, I wrote my first search warrant to search that apartment because he was committing, or she was committing, a felony by growing marijuana. And so we conducted our raid, and we got our plane off the balcony, and there I was. I was confirmed I was a narc. Let me say that most of my arrest when I was doing that work was about marijuana. And as we know, most of the arrests today still about marijuana possession. I arrested hundreds of people when I was working undercover, and most of it, again, was about marijuana possession. Here's a good example of some of the important work that I did. In a county called, in a town, Prince Frederick in Calvert County, Maryland, we had some serious drug dealing going on. And I was ordered to go to this county to meet with a judge who wanted change in that county. And he gave me a list of people who worked at 2 clubs. One was called the Burroughs Club on Route 4. The other was called the Duke's Lounge right in the town of Prince Frederick. And they were the only 2 black clubs in the entire county. So at the Duke's Lounge, my target was a person by the name of Gant. And at the Burroughs Club, it was just whoever I could find. The judge wanted those clubs closed down. So obviously, if I went and bought drugs, not from the owners or the people who worked there, but just from people who were patrons there, they would close them down. And you know what? Here I am, a young 22-year-old trooper, and I just went and did what I was told to do. A few months later, they were closed. See, we didn't target the white clubs, you know. And what did I buy out of those clubs? Marijuana. So I go and eventually head back to the field, and I end up getting promoted, and I'm eventually a lieutenant. And now I'm commanding drug task forces in the western part of the state where I had 7, and now I'm in charge of drug task forces, and we heard the horror stories behind drug task forces, what they can evolve to, where we're now making, per county, hundreds, if not thousands, of arrests. I continue to go up through the ranks, and now I'm a major, and I have the Northeast region for the Bureau. Again, Bureau of Drug and Criminal Enforcement, and I've got 9 task forces on that side of the state, and we continue to work. You know, there was a young black trooper. Now, throughout my career, I'm having a glimpse here and there of the improprieties, the disparity issues, civil asset forfeiture problems and issues, but still not enough to change my perspective on this whole issue. And while I'm now in the Northeast Regional Command, I have this young black trooper who eventually works his way into my office to see me after multiple requests, because he realizes that he's getting a substandard grade on his evaluation for initiative because he doesn't have time. Well, his sergeant says he's not developing enough cases, but at the end of the day, they were farming this young black trooper out to task force after task force after task force to go work black neighborhoods. So he had no time to do his own work in a part of our state where there are only a handful of black communities, mainly rural. Another glimpse, but still I continued, and now we're into the late 90s. And I become the commander of training for the Maryland State Police, and then I retire and now find myself working for the Baltimore Police Department as the head of training. Baltimore is my hometown. I grew up in Baltimore. I'm very familiar with all the problems we had in Baltimore. The HBO series The Wire was mentioned earlier. And folks, if you haven't seen it, spend some time with Netflix or whoever and watch it, It's not fiction. It's really about 30 years of Baltimore history involving the drug trade and politics and policing and education and health and commerce, all compressed into 5 years. And the drug dealing that you see and the violence on the corners and the gangs fighting each other and the shootouts, and they were filmed on the actual corners where this took place. This wasn't a Hollywood set anywhere. It's a very, very good piece of information, very good to watch. And so in the 90s, there was a mayor by the name of Kurt Schmoke in Baltimore. And he had been the prosecutor. So here's another glimpse for me. He had been the prosecutor. And then he eventually was elected to be mayor. As prosecutor, he saw the problems of violent crime. We had a detective working narcotics undercover by the name of Marcellus Ward, who was buying drugs, working a case in an apartment. He was killed doing that drug buy. And the prosecutor, he was then, Kurt Schmoke at that time had to listen to the audio of that shooting. Then he becomes mayor. And now he's dealing with health issues, hepatitis C, AIDS, intravenous drug use. So him and his health commissioner start a needle exchange program. They needed a uniformed member from law enforcement on that board. Here, it was me. I was then a lieutenant with the Maryland State Police. Here's another glimpse of the failures, the problems of our drug policy. Baltimore is a heroin town. We love heroin, and so we have, unfortunately, a big problem with that. But it wasn't until I was then working for the Baltimore Police Department that the final straw came on a camel's back. A good friend of mine, Ed Totley, who was a narcotics agent for the Maryland State Police, he had been working undercover for about 13, 14 years. He had worked a very significant case for me on the eastern shore of Maryland. He was now working a Safe Streets campaign with the FBI in Washington, D.C. He was buying cocaine from a mid-level drug dealer. He had been working this individual for a while. And this was going to be the final buy, October 30th of 2000, the final buy. He had talked a little bit about this case to me, even though I'm now working with Baltimore. We're good friends. So he was talking about this case, and I knew the culmination of this case was about to happen. And I'm home one night, and a phone call comes, and it's a mutual friend, law enforcement friend, calling me to tell me that something had happened. So during this final buy in Washington, D.C., this drug dealer decided that this was the time that he was going to rip Ed Totley off. That's the nature of this illicit underground business. You rip each other off. He wanted to keep the drugs and the money. And unfortunately, as a drug dealer, you know if you're going to rip off another drug dealer, you better kill him. Because if not, they will find you and they will kill you or hurt you or maybe kidnap a family member or maybe hurt a family member. So when he comes back to the car rather quickly where Ed's waiting for the cocaine, he surprises Ed and he just shoots him at point blank range in the side of the head. Now, while at the hospital where there are literally hundreds of police officers and family members, you know, and I get that call at home about this shooting, and I knew exactly what it was as soon as Doug called me and told me that Ed had been shot. I knew exactly what it was. And when I get to the hospital, unfortunately, Ed had already died. And you could hear other police officers talking about how they were going to go out, just go back out and just kick ass. They're going to arrest and hassle any and everybody who has anything to do with drugs. And by this time, by this stage in the game, in this drug war, we had already moved from going after kingpins to just arresting any and everybody. Okay, we're no longer really interested in the sellers. Okay, we're going to go after the users. And that's what they did. But there were a couple of us who said, wait a minute. Let's just reflect on this for a moment. The violence here. Started thinking again about Marcellus Ward, who I mentioned earlier, who was working undercover at the same time that I was. I was down with the Baltimore Police Department, and shortly after Ed was killed, you know, so don't get me wrong, we didn't make this, I didn't have this premonition overnight after Ed was killed, but as time went on, we're continuing to think about this. I'm having conversations with other cops. And during this time, over the next couple of years, I had 2 police officers in Baltimore City who were killed on a street by drug dealers. 2 years after Ed was killed, something else happened. I had a family of 7 in Baltimore, in East Baltimore, the Dawson family. The mother, Angela, was doing what we want good citizens to do. Come on, work with us. Tell us about those drug dealers in your neighborhood, and we'll come scoop them up, get them out of your hair. That's what she was doing. She had a corner row house, and right on that corner in that intersection of Preston Street was a drug crew. Set up shop. He finds out about her cooperation with the police because the police aren't the most secretive people. And he's going to send a message. So again in October of 2003, this time, he sets their home on fire early one morning and kills the entire family, 5 kids and parents. See, it's not just about being a dangerous occupation for cops. It's in these communities where we have these open-air drug markets, it's dangerous for every daggone body. It's dangerous for the citizens, the kids. And yes, it's dangerous for those who partake in the business. During this process, I'm still one of few law enforcement folks who are starting to talk about this, and because my circle is still very small in the Baltimore area. But the internet is flourishing. And so I go on the internet and I'm looking for backup, right? Is there anyone else out there, any other cops out there thinking the same thing? And I stumbled across LEAP's brand new website. And I sent an email and I get a response back from Jack Cole. Many of you might be familiar with Jack Cole. He's one of the co-founders of the organization. And we communicate a little bit, and I'm working with the Baltimore Police Department still as the head of training. I then eventually move on to another police department, Maryland Transit, where I'm the head of the Detective Bureau for a while and then Chief of Patrol. And in 2008, I officially started speaking for LEAP. But what's interesting, it was violence that brought me to this place of transformation and got me looking at this from a different perspective. But after joining up with LEAP, and now I'm starting to learn about all the other problems with prohibition. And as I say, I'm not just talking about marijuana, folks. I'm talking about all these drugs that are illegal. So I started learning about, obviously, mass incarceration. In 2010, I happened to meet Michelle Alexander. She had just written her book, The New Jim Crow, and if you haven't read that book, it's got to be #1 on your list if this subject is of interest to you. So I started learning about mass incarceration. I start learning about the militarization of our police departments, and I reflect back, and I can see in my mind how we had gone from somewhat of a community-type friendly police department to one of, well, resembling the military. As the head of training, I think about all the people we would hire who were coming from the military, who had spent time in the Gulf War. And we're now going to, our military bases and recruiting people who had just been active in war and bringing them into our ranks. I start thinking about how our police uniforms have changed. From one that's, rather, nice crisp pants, the white shirts and shiny shoes and somewhat of a friendly appearance, but now what do they look like? Jump boots, the blousing of the pants into the boots. The ballistic vests have come from the inside now to the outside. They used to be under the shirt. Now they're on the outside, just like the military with their flat vests. Very seldom would you see anyone with a helmet, unless they were maybe riding motorcycles, but now you see helmets all the time. The gear, everything has just changed. The corruption I started learning about. I started learning about Central America and the problems of violence there. I started learning about the divide between police and community. And I just realized that, just like depicted in the HBO series The Wire, this issue of drug policy, prohibition, affects each and every one of us. It affects health, it affects education, it affects commerce, and on and on. What other health issue? That's what this is. This is a health issue. What other health issue, concern in this country would we ever think of using criminal justice to solve? So, I have so much more that I can talk about, but you guys need to hear from Radley. I know he's around here somewhere. And as the other two speak, as Radley comes up to speak, and as Ira Glasser comes up to speak, you're going to hear more and more about some of these problems that I'm referring to. The big question, and again, I'm not just talking about marijuana. I'm talking about all of these drugs that are illicit. This industry of all of these drugs has existed for a very long time. It exists today. It's going to exist tomorrow when we're long dead and gone. The question is, who better to manage the industry of these drugs? If you think the cartels and our neighborhood crews and gangs are doing such a wonderful job with murder, intimidation, kidnappings, coercion, and so on, if you think they're just doing such a wonderful job in raking in $322 billion globally every year that they use to buy guns and bribe public officials and cops, and if that's just such a wonderful thing, okay, let's continue. I'm not even mentioning mass incarceration, but if you think it's a wonderful job, let's continue. But if you think that a system of regulation and control will do a better job, then let's continue the work that we started with marijuana. Marijuana is the linchpin to unraveling this whole mess. You've heard testimony after testimony after testimony. We, the police, rely so much on marijuana to do the damage that is being done. After we're done with marijuana, folks, it's moving. And I think by somewhere between 2016 and 2020, we could be pretty much good saying, okay, marijuana is going to continue to go. We still have a lot more work to do. We got to deal with heroin. We got to move it again from a place of criminal justice to a place of health. Cocaine, criminal justice to a place of health. Crystal meth. And if you're sitting there thinking that, oh my God, but these are bad drugs, two things. Number one, if these drugs are so bad, how can we leave them in the hands of criminals to manage in our communities? And number two, to learn more about these drugs, read a book, High Price by Carl Hart. High Price by Carl Hart. You'll have a different perception of those as well. Thank you very much.